Thanks everyone for joining our webinar. This is the second webinar in our series on transitioning campuses for colleges and universities to 100% renewable energy. This webinar is going to focus on campus building electrification. Environment America earlier this year put out our Renewable Energy 101 fact sheet series, which is 11 tools and strategies that campuses can use to transition to 100% renewable energy. And one of those tools is campus building electrification, a pretty important tool to reaching 100% renewable energy. And today I'm joined by three speakers. So we have Bruce Nilles, a senior fellow at the Rocky Mountain Institute, Vincent Martinez, the chief operating officer at Architecture 2030, and David Liss, the director of technology and market solutions at Northeast Energy Efficiency Partnerships. And they're each going to talk a little bit about building electrification with an eye towards college and university campuses. So we are going to get started with Bruce Nilles.
Great, thank you, and I'm thrilled to join you. So again, Bruce Nilles with the Rocky Mountain Institute. It's actually a real treat to be joining you today. I've been with Rocky Mountain Institute for a little over 6 months. Before that, I spent 15 years at the Sierra Club building and leading the Sierra Club's Beyond Coal campaign, and one of the very first projects I worked on was helping get rid of coal on my alma mater, the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And that was a really exciting project campaign with a lot of students. And we ultimately got what at the time was the largest source of carbon pollution in downtown Madison offline. And that leaves the big challenge ahead, which is getting rid of all the gas that is remaining on campuses across the United States. And as you likely know, there's not a lot of coal plants left on campuses these days. Most of them are gone. I think we're down to about a dozen. But the real big question is how to get to zero carbon. How do we get rid of a lot of the fossil fuel use, gas use that is remaining on campus? So if we go to the first slide, just by way of background, who Rocky Mountain Institute is, we've been around since 1982, founded by Amory Lovins. So what we really help do is bring a lot of technical and economic expertise to solving some of the most compelling or dire challenges we're facing at moving from fossil fuels to clean energy. And the urgency, as we all know, is pretty upon us. So let me move to the next slide just to sort of put the context of what we have before us. This is a slide just giving us a sense of how quickly we need to be moving to decarbonize. And in a nutshell, the longer we wait, the deeper the cuts need to be if we're going to avoid runaway climate change. And as this chart really indicates, is starting today, here at the beginning of 2019, we're really talking about a rate of about 10% reduction per year. So this is not waiting till 2050. This is the urgency of getting started today. And buildings are a big piece of that puzzle. So the next slide really was a sort of a wake-up call from the International Energy Agency late last year, as they put out a further details about what's the challenge ahead. And basically, if we're going to avoid the worst effects of climate change, we don't have the opportunity to build anything new. Specifically as that relates to campus, that would be including new buildings connected to the gas grid, new district heating with gas, or any other large new fossil fuel projects. That's the challenge ahead, is not dig the hole any deeper. So next slide really is digging into, and this is US focused for today. We do work around the world, but thought it would be helpful to focus my talk at least on the US challenge. This is from EPA, the amount of greenhouse gases from various sectors. The orange in the bottom right is buildings. This is just the carbon emissions, and I'll get to the other associated issue of methane in a minute. But as you can see, fuels in building, that is the burning of natural gas, fuel oil, and propane, is about 10% of US emissions. The biggest piece of that is for space heating, but right behind that is water heating, and then cooking and other uses make up about 13%. This varies enormously across the United States. Obviously, a lot more space heating in cold climates, like in the Northeast and the upper Midwest. So this graph, for example, in California, where I am based, half of the fossil fuel use is for heating hot water, and a lot less space heating because our climate is much more mild. But this gives you some sense of the national issue. Next slide. One of just often forgotten is that natural gas is more than 80% methane. And so methane is a super pollutant. And I want to give an anecdote from Boston, where back in 2015, Harvard did a study that looked at the methane leakage from all the pipes. This wasn't associated with the burning of gas, but just the leakage. And they found just within the city of Boston, the equivalent of about 300,000 tons of methane emissions. Well, what does that translate into? If you convert methane into carbon emissions, it's about 25 million metric tons of carbon equivalents associated with that methane leakage just from the gas distribution system in Boston. And that's more than the biggest coal plant in North America, which is the Miller coal plant in Alabama, which in 2017 put out about 22 million metric tons. So just underscoring, as we're thinking about the urgency of getting gas in particular out of our buildings, there are two benefits. One is it reduces the burning, which has both climate and health impacts, but it also eliminates the use, the leakage of methane, which by most estimates essentially doubles the climate impacts of natural gas. Next slide. So here's a sort of summary, sort of thinking about this problem holistically, systemically. In the United States, there's about 70 million buildings that are burning gas, oil, and propane. It's about 500 million tons of CO2. There's a huge network of pipelines that carry this gas, and they are leaking from the wellhead where it is produced all the way to the homes. The most recent good work of Environmental Defense Fund and others indicates that the leakage rate is about 2.3% of methane. No one had looked behind the meter. And there's a recent study here in California looking at 70 homes, and they found another significant amount of leakage behind the meter, which gets you just shy of 3% through the most conservative estimates that are out there. And again, if you get to 3% leakage or above, you're basically doubling the climate impacts of gas. So the benefits of reducing gas use are that you're getting both the carbon reductions and significant methane reductions simultaneously. Next slide. So the thing about the building sector is that its situation is actually getting worse. The good news in the United States is that there's part of our economy that's actually been making enormous progress. Over in the electric sector, we have been replacing coal with clean energy at a greater rate than any other sector in the world. US emissions in the electric sector are down about 26% or 700 million metric tons. And coal plants, despite what the current administration in DC is trying to do, continue to retire at the rate of every 20 to 30 days. So every 20 to 30 days since this current administration took office, coal plants have been retiring permanently and coming offline. And so the electric sector is getting cleaner at a very nice clip as wind and solar gets installed at record levels. Not so with our buildings. Building emissions, the burning of fossil fuels in buildings is up last year 10%. And in part, that is because we are adding new buildings, and the default in most places is gas. And we continue to install record amounts of gas appliances, as this slide indicates, about 4 million gas hot water heaters, versus the much cleaner, much more efficient electric hot water heat pumps. So right now the situation is going in the wrong direction, and that's why I'm excited to be part of this webinar, really focusing on the need to be thinking systemically about how do we get gas out of buildings and electrify them. So let's jump to the next slide. So while not specifically focused on commercial or university buildings, RMI last year did a study that really tried to answer a couple of questions. One is, what are the carbon benefits of electrifying? There have been, in the days of old, when coal made up 50% of our electricity, it was a much more difficult question. Does it make sense to electrify? And that question was even more complicated when we had inefficient electric technology a decade ago. when the answer was it probably didn't make sense to electrify 10, 15 years ago. Today, the economics of both the economics, the technology, and the opportunity is fundamentally different and better. And this report lays out that the carbon benefits are good everywhere. Next slide. And that the opportunity to electrify end uses, that is replacing fossil fuels in our buildings, offers huge opportunities across the entire United States today. And the second piece, just to note, is that obviously if we are adding new electric load to our buildings, through our buildings, it has a profound impact on the electric grid. And how we manage this and how do we think smartly about integrating new electrical load through grid interactive buildings is both critical to manage it, but also offers huge opportunities to integrate significant amounts of wind and solar. If we think about buildings as batteries and the storage opportunities in, for example, hot water, there are profound opportunities to actually have buildings be an enormous enabler of adding more clean energy. Next slide. I think I have two more here. So the results, again, they were focused on residential buildings, but the same concepts apply to all types of buildings, is that electrification is cost effective today in a bunch of scenarios. The most effective scenarios are new construction, the simple fact that you don't have to build all the gas infrastructure. If you don't have gas in the building, offers huge savings. And so new construction is the most obvious place and critical because buildings last so long. So making sure all new construction is electrified. Any uses of oil or propane, which are particularly expensive, offer huge opportunities for electrification today. And then for customers or building owners who are thinking about replacing their entire system, HVAC system, doing that together with a heat pump, which provides both services, offers significant savings in most instances. And just a few other factors that we found that make economics better. One is the time of use rates that utility offers. Adding on-site solar can help a lot in many instances. Efficiency remains important as a way to minimize the overall need for either electricity or anything else. And then getting utilities to align their incentive programs. The crazy thing today in the United States is in that every state, with a caveat from Massachusetts, or an asterisk from Massachusetts, is that every state, including California, New York, climate leading states, they are incentivizing today the extension of gas lines and gas appliances. Those programs are helping tip the scales in favor of gas. Simply fixing those will help a lot to make sure that the cleaner carbon, low carbon alternative is what we're actually seeing. And then the last point is important, that electrification makes sense everywhere today in the United States. Replacing end-use gas, oil, propane with clean electricity from a carbon perspective is great today, and it's only going to get better as we continue to retire coal and replace more and more of them with clean energy. So my last slide, I guess, sorry, two quick slides. One is it's just building on the point that how buildings can be integrated as a way to really help with the grid management. The four images, one is what a typical commercial building looks like today. The second one shows solid line as you lower the load through energy efficiency. The third one indicates what happens when you have an efficient building with solar PV. You can get a trough during the noon time when solar is at its peak. If you have a smart integrated building, it can really help levelize that demand, which really helps with the overall grid management. So that's just a schematic of the importance of why, as we electrify more buildings, that they're also grid integrated in the smartest possible way. So the last slide is basically the recommendations. The urgency of today, given the climate crisis is upon us. The need to cut fossil fuel use in half over the next decade and the rest shortly thereafter. The opportunity to prioritize electrification today, where the various places, that's what recommendation number 2 is about. Number 3 is local utilities who are just beginning to wrestle with electrification in most places or haven't even started the conversation. There's a big opportunity to work with them to really design programs in a way that as we are electrifying, they are providing the right incentives and the right programs to really help with rapid decarbonization. The importance of how we do this can either increase inequities, but if we were smart at the front end, how do we do this in a way that is providing public health benefits and also building a much more inclusive workforce, particularly among contractors? Thinking about that from the front end. And then the last one, of course, is as we are beginning to do this across the country, how are we measuring, reporting, and sharing lessons so that we can be replicating successes and avoiding mistakes learned elsewhere. So back to you, Bronte.
Great, thanks, Bruce. We are going to turn it over to Vincent Martinez with Architecture 2030. So we're going to switch our screen share so you guys can see Vincent's slides.
All right, are we good?
Yes.
Great. Well, thanks for having me. And Bruce, thanks for that overview. I think it was really wonderful to see the research coming out of Rocky Mountain Institute. Architecture 2030, for those of you that don't know us, we're a think tank, small, flexible think tank that focuses on rapidly transforming the global environment from the major contributor of greenhouse gas emissions and climate change, central part of the solution. And we've been around now for about 14 years as a nonprofit led by our founder and CEO, Eduardo Mazzaria, renowned architect and educator. What we focus on, I want to start at the global perspective and then get down to the campus level that you're all working at. Just on a broad sense, if you look at major industry sectors across the globe, buildings are the largest chunk. When you consider building operations and the embodied carbon associated with building materials and construction practices, it is larger than any other industry globally in terms of its emissions profile. And when we look at the building sector itself, annually, building operations, which is what we typically focus on and what we're talking about in this webinar, is about 3/4 of our emissions profile annually. But embodied carbon to create our growing building stock, which we'll talk about in just a moment, is also a very significant piece. So I know it's outside the scope a bit from this conversation, but it's important that we recognize as all the new growth is happening, the embodied carbon of materials and construction practices is also a critical piece. And as we decarbonize our operations, it will be the entire building sector's contribution to climate change. Just Bruce mentioned a bit about the growth in the U.S. The global growth is gigantic as well. If we look at the global building stock now through 2060, we're adding essentially a New York City every 35 days for the next 40 years in terms of equivalent building stock. We're essentially doubling the existing building stock of the world in a 40-year period. So that's pretty mind-boggling when we consider that. It only makes us recognize that making sure we don't add to that emissions problem from the building sector, as Bruce said, is absolutely critical if we're going to meet our carbon goals. And you can think of campuses in the same way. Many of you are probably experiencing growth in your campuses just to the influx of urban population globally, and this will be an issue for you as well. So there are really three main pieces in the building sector that we need to decarbonize. Again, one is new buildings, given the mass amount of global growth in the building sector. Of course, then we still have about 3/4 of our existing building stock that will be around in 2050 that need to get retrofitted. And then again, on that new construction, how do we create a zero carbon materials or carbon sequestering materials and construction practices? So I'm going to touch a little bit on these three topics and we'll get into more details about electrification as we go forward. In terms of operation, it's pretty straightforward. We recognize that buildings will use energy. There's this concept of zero energy buildings, and really that's sort of a technical term that has not been used appropriately in terms of what it really means. They will use energy. They just happen to produce all their own energy on site, for example, and don't pull energy from the grid. But buildings will use energy, and it's important that we recognize where that energy comes from. So we recently launched something called the Zero Code, which is a standard for jurisdictions to adopt, and universities and campuses could also adopt this for new construction practices that say essentially two things. One is follow the best energy efficiency codes that are currently out there right now. So there are a number of standards available. ASHRAE is the current leading standard on this that is globally applicable. And they have a new standard that came out in 2016 that sets the energy efficiency portions of the buildings. So that can remain the same, the highest standard, but really the inspiration of the zero code is that the remainder of all the power of the building is powered not just on site, but also through offsite procurement. Now, Bronte and I were speaking in this preparation of this webinar. I think there's a growing recognition that on-site renewables and on-campus even renewables are potentially not enough to power our building stock, especially as we electrify the natural gas consumption for heating, as Bruce mentioned, that we're going to be taxing the grid. And so we need to be coupling our electrification efforts with on-site renewable and off-site renewable procurement. And there's a lot of really great progress being made on that front in universities and campuses throughout the US and globally. Now, in terms of existing buildings, there are thousands and thousands of incentive programs across the globe in order to encourage energy efficiency. Primarily, as Bruce mentioned, most of these programs aren't necessarily encouraging electrification, although many are changing that. But thousands and thousands of programs, and unfortunately, we're only upgrading our existing building stock by 0.5% to 1% each year annually. And you just do the math over the next 30 years, we're only reaching 1/3 of the existing building stock. So what really needs to happen, and what we're starting to see, is policies and regulations being adopted, typically at a municipal level, but also at a state level, that really changes the name of how we approach this. It's not specifically to energy efficiency upgrades, but really energy upgrades as a whole, which include energy efficiency, but also renewable energies on site or off-site procurement and electrification. So we're going to see more and more of these kind of policies coming up, and we really need to use the intervention points that we have in the building sector, like typical renovations and accelerating those to deep renovations, sales of buildings, and having energy upgrades apply there, so that we can get up to 3% of our existing building stock renovated each year to these standards. And if you do that math, 30 years times 3%, then you get the majority of the building stock covered with these interventions. But right now, the policies and regulations, you can count them on one hand globally that exist in this sphere, in this direction. But we're starting to see more and more policies, and I think in the next few years, you're going to see handfuls of policies like this that will affect campuses. But also, campuses can be mini cities and test beds, and you could apply policies like this moving forward for all the renovations in your campus, for example, to look beyond energy efficiency to electrification and renewables as you phase those in over time. And then the one, again, that is a little bit outside of the scope, but important to always remember, is that embodied carbon piece. And just a short segue on this is that we typically approach this through an entire life cycle assessment of our products that we use in building construction, from raw resource extraction through manufacturing, on-site construction, and demolition. And that's a time-intensive process given how many building materials we use in our individual buildings. So we really need to take the same approach that we do with energy efficiency, where we provide not just a performance path where we do that modeling and understand the full life cycle, but also prescriptive paths, so that campuses and universities, as you build, understand what kind of concrete, what kind of steel, what are the big carbon intensive materials, how do you just select better materials? What does low embodied concrete look like? What does low embodied steel look like? And last year we put out a carbon smart materials palette to do just that from a design perspective. And we focused on the heavy hitting materials of usually in the core and shell of buildings. So it's a resource for you, again, outside of the electrification scope, but just as critical as we start to decarbonize building operations. So that was just an overview quickly of the whole building stock globally and the areas that we need to focus on, but I'll talk specifically about the ideas of electrification here. Bruce mentioned some of these statistics earlier, but if we look at U.S. building energy consumption by fuel, we see that it's almost half and half when you consider fossil fuels on site versus electricity consumption in a building. And this typically gets left out of the conversation, whether that's a campus or a city, when we talk about going 100% renewable. There's a lot of commitments out there about 100% renewable, and for the most part, what they're really referring to is 100% renewable electricity. Most of those conversations leave out this big chunk, half of this pie, on the on-site fossil fuel use, predominantly natural gas. So I'm really excited that Bronte and Environment America and this program are looking at the natural gas issue in existing buildings as a major focus of being 100% renewable. It means not having those on-site fossil fuels, as well as having 100% electric renewable from renewables. But if we look at the emissions profile, that was just energy consumption. The emissions profile is actually slightly different, and I appreciate Bruce's focus on the individual systems, which we'll get to. But overall, for the building sector, electric power is still the predominant emission. That doesn't mean we shouldn't focus on natural gas. As I said, it is absolutely critical. Half the energy use is natural gas. But we have to also recognize that as a country, the majority of our electric power is still fossil fuel and much more intense than the use of on-site natural gas. And to some of Bruce's points, this doesn't take into account things like the methane leaks that he brought up, which would really shift this probably back into more of a half and half kind of approach. But it still recognizes that we have to do both. We have to do electrification, get rid of on-site fuels, and we have to clean the electric grid at the same time. So I think that's an important perspective as you work within your campuses. Now I'm going to give some examples of some city work that we've done, and we can obviously think of campuses as small cities. You probably don't have much single-family residential buildings, but you certainly have a lot of dormitories and multifamily. And so this is an example of one city that we've looked at in terms of their natural gas energy use and their electricity energy use. And depending on the climate, as Bruce mentioned, this is a colder climate city, and so we're seeing more natural gas use in these buildings. We do see commercial buildings tend to use more electricity than natural gas, even in colder climates, but there's still a predominant amount of natural gas. And the electricity grid in this city happens to be about half of it is done with fossil fuels, and the other is from cleaner non-emitting fuels in the electricity grid. And what's interesting about this, though, is when you look at it switching from energy to emissions, you see, again, a different focus here. But sorry, one more comment, which is that this city is predominantly made up of campuses. So this is a breakdown of the energy consumption by building typology in this city, and you can see the importance of getting campus facilities that include those top 4 sections, really the top 5. Educational buildings as a whole, laboratory buildings, which is a big part of campuses, lodging, and 8+ residential units are essentially your dormitories and your office space. So we can really think of this city like as a campus, and that the campuses within cities in certain areas are the majority of the building stock. And so it's really important that campuses lead this effort to decarbonize and to look at electrification. So here's again the emissions profile of this city, and you'll see that our green bars are a little bit bigger, and again that has to do with the grid here. I want to note that Bruce is right, this doesn't take into account some of those methane leaks from the grid of the natural gas grid, but still we need to consider doing both electrification coupled with renewable energy procurement and production. So it's important that we don't just add additional demand from the utility grid, and the electricity grid has happened to be still pretty carbon intensive. If we want to go to zero, we have to do both. And again, mentioning the importance in this city of campuses. We look at a second city, this is more of a marine climate. So the natural gas use is down. This happens to be a lot of single family in this city. I'll go through this a little quickly since you've seen it before, but again, this is actually even dirtier of a grid. You can see how much coal and natural gas are a part of the electricity grid here. And it really does start to shift the picture on terms of emissions for these buildings. Now that said, we have to go to zero. So even in these buildings where it doesn't appear that from an emission perspective currently that their natural gas is a huge portion of their emission profile, it is still a significant amount and requires it to be phased out over time. So it's important that we don't add new buildings that can increase the natural gas amounts from emissions in this perspective, as well as transition our existing buildings in this way. And again, this is just the split of building types. In that case, campuses was not heavily dominated by campuses. So I just want to show you some examples of some of the other cities, and I think you'll start to see a trend here. These are all more heating load dominated cities. So they're colder climates. You'll see a lot of natural gas use by energy. And it actually matters about the building type as well. You'll see single family residential, which is the SFR in the first column for each city, is almost 3/4 natural gas use, and that's all mostly heating, whereas commercial buildings tend to use more electricity. So the strategies will depend on building typology as well in terms of how it's prioritized, but it's still a significant portion in all cities. Now, the most interesting one is the third one here I wanted to show you, You'll still see a lot of natural gas being used, half of it in single-family residential, about a quarter in multifamily residential and commercial in terms of energy consumption. But we're going to look here at the grids of these different cities. And when you pick a city like the last two, or second to last two that we see here, so the ones that are below this natural gas line, which is the fossil fuel intensity of on-site natural gas, when you get to cleaner grids, so these are clean grid cities, and in fact the one second to last is a city that's completely carbon neutral electricity grid, predominantly hydropower, but could also come from other renewables. We start to see a completely different focus area when we look at emissions. And I'll just skip to that because it's my last point I want to make. That's the second to last city here. You'll see that electricity, when you're 100% clean electricity, is now no longer at all part of your equation in terms of decarbonization. It is all on-site fossil fuel use. So as we start to transition very, very quickly to 100% renewable energy from electricity in cities and in campuses, your entire focus becomes how to electrify and take advantage of that clean electricity. So I wanted to show you just an example of the transition. We'll see very, very quickly that most cities and campuses, as they start to do renewable power procurement or on-site generation of renewables, will look like the second to last city here, which is main focus is decarbonization of pulling out natural gas and replacing it with electricity use. So I'll stop there.
Great, thanks, Vincent. So now we will turn it over to David Liss, who works with Northeast Energy Efficiency Partnerships, to talk a little bit more about building electrification.
Great. Thanks, Bronte, and thanks, Bruce and Vincent, for your remarks. Good to be with you this afternoon on a Friday afternoon, at least here on the East Coast. Why don't you go to the next slide, Bronte? As Bronte mentioned, I direct our our technology and market solutions team. I do a lot of work around market transformation for particular technologies. One of those that we started 5 years ago was around air source heat pumps, and more recently we've been doing some more assessing and developing some more resources around strategic electrification. So a couple of different things have kind of come together, at least for me, that relate very much to building electrification, long-term decarbonization. So happy to share a few more thoughts today. NEEP is a regional energy efficiency organization where our territory is New England, New York, down through DC, and really focused on promoting and driving energy efficiency into the region. And more recently, we've taken a more thoughtful and purposeful making carbon reduction really part of our the mission. So no longer simply energy efficiency, and that's part of the story that I think we're trying to talk about today, is that some of the really well-known strategies and pathways towards decarbonization are not enough. So let's go to the next slide. So I know we're sort of banging you over the head with this today, but the idea of energy efficiency is really well known, recognized, and I think campuses are focused on continuing to drive energy efficiency. The renewable electricity gets a lot of attention, and a lot of goals and targets have been set around this. It's this third piece that we've been talking about this afternoon that is, I'd say, probably the less appreciated, less understood element of getting to really deep levels of decarbonization. So if we don't leave you with any other message today, I think this is probably one of them to take back to your work on campuses to broaden the suite of strategies and focus areas to go beyond kind of traditional energy efficiency, go beyond the great work that's happening to reduce the carbon footprint of electricity, but really to start thinking about this broader strategic electrification. This certainly includes transportation and buildings as well, but there are, to Bruce's point, to Vincent's point, I think they made the case that there is this is really a kind of a big piece of the pie. And I'm gonna give you my next slide and give you my sort of where we've come from to this point, at least in the Northeast, and this is probably a growing situation throughout the country, and this is probably reflective of a lot of college campuses, is these states making really strong commitments towards deep carbon reductions. And in the Northeast, that really is kind of all really been pointing towards these long, at least the 80 by 50 and some other more near-term targets. But it's been, I would say that's really, this has become more of a regional focus than just a one-off kind of thing. So this led us into a strategic electrification assessment. Really, what does that mean, and what does that mean towards getting towards these long-term targets? Next slide. And so this is just another view of this question about, aren't we on the path to 80% carbon reductions? And the point of this is that even with continuing to do energy efficiency and getting to a clean grid, you're really halfway there. And again, this is at a regional New England and New York view, but it's very applicable at the city and even at the campus level. So next slide. Question is where are all these other emissions coming from? And as you've heard, next slide, they're coming from the direct use of fossil fuels. And I know we're talking about buildings today. Obviously, transportation makes up a big piece of that. So that's a huge opportunity, at a regional level, at a national level, but should be part of the mix as part of your focus at the campus level as well. To the point, and so today, at least sort of looking at the residential and commercial side, as has been mentioned, space heating and water heating are really dominate the direct use of fossil fuels in buildings. Traditional furnaces and boilers and being fed by natural gas, fuel oil, propane. Those are sort of the existing technologies that dominate the market today. Next slide. So looking at what are those jump back. Sorry. What are those alternative electric advanced electrification technologies? And certainly on the transportation side, people are familiar with electric vehicles, more so on the light duty side, but certainly more work happening on sort of the trucking side and heavy duty. But back to the buildings, between heat pump water heaters on the water heating side, to air source heat pumps, and on the residential and commercial side, and ground source heat pumps being some of these new alternative technologies that could replace the traditional heating systems that homes and businesses and campuses are used to deploying. Next slide. Part of this is really to suggest that there's been a lot of research and assessment and analysis about what these long-term decarbonization pathways look like, and there's really a lot of them are pointing to these technologies and these solutions as that really tangible pathway to get us to where we want to. So just to put our work into perspective, there's a lot of great work that's been going on, and you see, the RMI report here, and many others that are coming to similar conclusions. Next slide. this is an observation that's not necessarily as important sort of at the campus level, but it really makes the point that these kinds of that campuses need to really be part of this accelerated transition towards these new technologies. Just to get, as far as the projections that we have out to 2050, just by 2035, we under our plausibly optimistic scenario need to have transitioned the vast majority of, let's say, the market share that had been delivered fuel, both well, in the Northeast we have quite a bit of delivered fuel, so we called this out specifically, but nearly 70% of the systems that are natural gas driven need to be replaced by heat pumps by 2035. So starting at a place that it's in the low single digits to these kinds of numbers is certainly sobering and exciting at the same time. We have obviously a huge opportunity, a lot of hard work to really transform these markets. So that's just another call to campuses to be part of that. Next slide. This is just a little bit more details on some of the air source and ground source technology. I don't think we need to spend too much time here. The one note on sort of the top end piece is the economics, at least in the Northeast, are better in the delivered fuel analysis versus the natural gas, but that certainly does not preclude, particularly in new construction, sometimes the economics can be very favorable even today for natural gas alternatives. Next slide. So just pulling forward a couple of examples of campuses that have implemented some exciting projects. This is a note on Ball State, really a massive ground source system, district system. So there are a couple of main well fields that feed into more of a district system that feeds 47 buildings and 5.5 million square feet. So this technology is here today and obviously delivering results today. Next slide. Cornell University. This is highlighting a development that's under construction. And this is going to be essentially a living lab that will be looking at the grid impacts of air source heat pumps and opportunities to actually manage the operation of air source heat pumps in a colder climate. But again, this is moving from very kind of small pilots to really large developments, and this is all electric building without gas. So it's really demonstrating that that the suite of technologies we have today can meet the needs of college campuses. Next slide. You don't necessarily know if we need to get bogged down on this one. This is really calling out, our report looked at sort of major market barriers for electrification. They range from obviously low awareness, and that's part of what we're talking about today, is really kind of raising the awareness on with the public, but obviously specifically folks that are involved with college campuses, that this is really an important piece of the pie, and that there are technologies out there, alternative technologies that are ready for prime time. But certainly there are others. There are supply chain issues, economic issues, whether they're technical or infrastructure barriers that exist, and higher level policy and regulatory barriers that we've called out. And if you want to get more into this, you can certainly access the report online. Next slide. The report sort of boils up some of the kind of high-level accelerators. The marketing, outreach, and education, certainly, I think, part of what we're doing today. But this piece, certainly from a campus perspective, you certainly can be leaders, lead by example to really to educate kind of the broader the students that are on campus, the faculty on campus, to really to demonstrate that these technologies work and are, you know, really familiarize them with these solutions. As far as mandates and targets, this is again at the state level, but campuses can certainly take this up, establishing targets to adopt these kind of technologies, both both the implementation of the technology, but as has been mentioned, the buildings themselves and the efficiency that goes into the buildings and on-site generation can be part of this, and but campuses can certainly lead and establish these kind of goals. There are emerging financing and business models that may be attractive to campuses as they're looking to roll out implementation of these kinds of technologies. Again, more info in the report. Let's go to the next slide. Some of the policy and program examples that are happening around the Northeast. Again, most of these are at the state there are alternative. So people are familiar with renewable portfolio standards. There are some of these renewable heating and cooling and heat pump technologies are being included in these types of programs that require utilities to procure a certain amount of renewable thermal, which heat pumps are included into. And there's certainly work going on the workforce side to ensure the workforce is trained and educated on these kind of technologies. Certainly a tremendous amount of work has been going into energy efficiency programs. More and more, well, we're seeing programs that have not really been able to promote electrification and fuel switching to be able to do so now. So I think to Bruce's point early on, certainly reach out and work with available programs wherever you are, whether it's utility or clean energy programs that states run, that can really help on the technical side and or the financial side. Next slide. This is just the point that building electrification, while it's really a huge opportunity and need on the carbon side, provides a lot of other benefits, and the little load shape graph there is really kind of a reference to the grid, that there are opportunities to electrify buildings and transportation that provide a lot of benefits to the grid and potentially lower rates for ratepayers. There's certainly potential cost savings, but comfort in the buildings, local and global health is certainly related to these. These buildings can be far more resilient, particularly on the energy efficiency side. And as we know, or at least in the Northeast, with recent gas line explosions, there's certainly some safety opportunities to improve on campuses. So next slide. So I'm finishing with this point again, really again driving the point home that as you are thinking on campuses about how to achieve these long-term decarbonization goals, this idea of building electrification needs to have its place alongside energy efficiency and renewable electricity goals. So I guess I will leave you with that and take any questions if they come along.
Awesome, thank you. So a big thank you to Bruce, Vincent, and David for talking a lot about the importance of building electrification and moving to 100% renewable energy and decarbonizing. This is contact information. If people have questions, I'm going to open it up to questions from some of the people who have joined the webinar. So to do that, I'm just going to stop our screen share so I can see your questions. You can raise your hand and I'll unmute you. So we have a question from Bennett, it looks like.
Now can you hear me? That sounds good.
Yeah.
This is Ben Brabson calling from Indiana University. I'm a climate scientist here, and I'm just introducing a tiny bit of information that comes from a different segment of the country. You've talked eloquently about the things going on in the Northeast, and I appreciate that very much. One of the things that is very special about a campus, of course, is that you have a number of buildings that are close together. The cities oftentimes take advantage of that as well. Here at Indiana University, for example, we have 200 buildings that are very close together and can share heating and do all sorts of things that have to do with saving energy by doing a number of things. One thing I was a little surprised to hear is that you did not mention anything about what I think of as cogeneration, the whole business of taking natural gas and instead of simply using it to heat buildings, that you actually generate electricity with that natural gas and then heat the buildings as well with the waste heat. Now, in the Northeast, or if you're trying to get to zero total carbon, that's not going to get you there. On the other hand, it does immediately cut our total efficiency, our total CO2 output by more than a factor of 2. So it seems to me that for many campuses, which are not perhaps as far along as those in the East, that you might consider suggesting other strategies, including cogeneration. What's your thought?
This is Bruce. Could I take a stab at that?
Sure.
Thank you for that comment. I spent a lot of time in the Midwest, including in Wisconsin, and around the Midwest, where there remained a fair number of coal-burning combined heat power facilities on campus. I think the issue today, where we sit in 2019, is that we're running out of time to sort of take a detour to invest in more natural gas. I think now that we know that we're clear-eyed, we've got to get to zero emissions in the next 1 to 2 decades, and that the impact of gas is at least twice as big as we thought it was because of the methane leakage. That time has come and gone, if there ever was such a good time for combined heat and power powered by gas. So I think it just, with the urgency of what the science tells us, we don't have, and obviously a combined heat and power plant would be amortized at least 30, 40 or more years. It doesn't fit within the climate budget, so we have the hard reality of the physics saying, on a path to zero, we don't have time to build a bunch of new gas infrastructure.
Interesting. My remembering that Indiana, of course, is 85% coal for electricity. That is, to make that switch in the short term would, of course, be the wrong direction to move.
Well, so the most amazing story, I would argue, in the last couple of months has come out of Indiana. Northern Indiana Public Service Corporation announced, after looking hard at the economics of clean energy, they're announcing they're retiring all of their coal plants in the next 7 years in the northern third of the state. And they're replacing it entirely with clean energy and their existing gas plants. So they're proposing to make the entire switch without building any new gas infrastructure and shut down all of their coal plants in a state, as you well know, that is not leading on climate grounds, but leading on economic grounds. And so I think you have some great examples right there in Indiana of something that very few other states have done. In fact, very few other utilities that had coal plants have ever done, which is to say, we're done with coal and we're not building new gas. So I think, again, I think the world is shifting fast with the reality of both economics and the climate reality, that it's time to hop and skip over any new fossil fuel investments.
Good point. Thanks.
Great. We are coming to the end of our time, so I just want to say thank you one more time to all of our speakers and to all of you who joined us on the webinar. We'll be sending out a recording to everyone who has joined. So you'll be able to reference back to this, use it on your campuses. And if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. It's bronte@environmentamerica.org. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.